Your compliance framework has a single point of failure: people remembering to follow it. An auditor asks a simple question: can you demonstrate that retention policies have been consistently applied across your Microsoft 365 environment for the past 3 years? And the compliance team realizes they can't. Not because the policies don't exist, they do. They're documented. They've been communicated and staff have been trained. But whether those policies were actually followed consistently across hundreds of SharePoint sites, thousands of Teams channels, and tens of thousands of documents depends entirely on whether individual employees remembered to do it every single time. That's the moment most organizations discover that their compliance framework is a set of instructions, not a system. In regulated industries, this isn't a theoretical risk. GDPR fines can reach 4% of global annual revenue. Healthcare violations run into millions. And recent enforcement actions have made it clear that regulators are looking for systemic compliance, not good intentions backed by training records. The traditional approach to compliance worked when information moved slowly. Legal would identify a new obligation, create a policy document, train the relevant staff, and implement manual processes to maintain compliance. That model assumed a manageable volume of data moving through a limited number of channels at a pace that human oversight could realistically govern. That assumption no longer holds. In a modern Microsoft 365 environment, a single document can be created in one country, accessed by a team in another, stored in a data center in a third, and subject to regulations from all 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. Data flows at digital speed across platforms, devices, and organizational boundaries. The volume and complexity of information movement has outpaced what manual compliance processes can reliably handle. Not because people are careless, but because no amount of training solves a scale problem. And there's a distinction most organizations overlook. Microsoft 365 as a platform holds extensive compliance certifications. Those certifications mean that Microsoft's infrastructure and operations meet regulatory requirements. They do not mean that any given organization's configuration of Microsoft 365 meets those requirements. The platform provides the tools. Whether those tools are configured correctly, applied consistently, and maintained over time is entirely an organizational responsibility. An organization running Microsoft 365 with default settings is operating on a certified platform with an uncertified implementation, and it's the implementation that auditors evaluate. There's another layer most compliance frameworks don't account for. When provisioning processes are too slow or too restrictive, users route around them using personal OneDrive accounts, external file sharing services, and unauthorized Teams channels. Every one of those ungoverned channels sits outside the compliance perimeter. DLP policies don't apply. Retention schedules don't apply. Audit trails don't capture the activity. The compliance framework looks comprehensive on paper, but it has gaps wherever shadow IT exists, and those gaps stay invisible until an audit or investigation reveals that relevant information was never under organizational control in the first place. So the question isn't whether an organization has compliance policies. Most do. The question is whether those policies are enforced by infrastructure or by human memory. Because in a regulated environment, the difference between those two things is the difference between passing an audit and explaining to an auditor why the framework that was supposed to work didn't. Compliance enforced by infrastructure looks different than most organizations expect. It doesn't mean more tools or more monitoring. It means embedding compliance decisions so deeply into the environment that they happen automatically. Here's what has to be true for that to work. First, automated data classification. Microsoft Purview can analyze documents and automatically identify regulated information based on content patterns, credit card numbers, healthcare identifiers, financial account information, and hundreds of other regulated data types can be detected and classified without human intervention. Trainable classifiers can learn to recognize organization-specific content types like customer contracts, financial reports, or strategic plans. When classification is automated, the question of whether someone remembered to label a document correctly stops being relevant. Second, policy-based protection that follows the data. Once information is classified, protection policies apply automatically based on what the data is rather than where it's stored. Encryption, access restrictions, sharing limitations, and usage monitoring are applied based on classification labels and regulatory requirements. A document containing regulated information carries its protection with it, whether it's in a SharePoint library, attached to an email, or downloaded to a mobile device. The protection doesn't depend on that document staying in a specific location. Third, compliance inheritance through governed provisioning. This is where the series connects. When every new site is created through a governed provisioning template, Compliance controls come with it automatically. A site provisioned for a customer project in a regulated industry carries the appropriate retention schedule, sensitivity labels, DLP policies, and access controls from the moment it's created. Compliance isn't a second step that someone has to configure. It's inherited from the template. The same applies to content types. When a document is created within a governed content type, the retention and classification policies follow it throughout its lifecycle, regardless of which site it lives in. Fourth, automated retention and lifecycle management. Content moves through defined stages based on policy rather than manual effort. When a document meets its retention requirement, the system handles disposition. When content hasn't been accessed in a defined period, the system flags it for owner review. When a legal hold is placed, retention schedules pause automatically for affected content. The entire lifecycle operates on rules rather than relying on someone to remember which documents need to be kept, which need to be archived, and which need to be destroyed. The implementation sequence starts with the highest risk content. Identify the documents that carry the most significant regulatory obligations, whether that's financial records, healthcare information, customer data, or classified materials. Implement automated classification and protection for that content first. Prove the model works in a limited scope with measurable compliance improvement. Then, expand classification to broader content categories. Connect compliance policies to provisioning templates so new sites inherit the right controls from creation. Deploy retention automation aligned to actual regulatory requirements rather than generic policies. And build the audit trail and reporting infrastructure that demonstrates consistent compliance to regulators. The measure of success isn't whether compliance policies exist. It's whether those policies are enforceable without depending on every employee in the organization remembering to follow them every time. The organizations that pass audits confidently are the ones where the platform enforces compliance automatically, so the question of whether someone remembered never comes up. After nearly 30 years of integrating Microsoft systems for mid to large enterprises and regulated industries, we've built compliance frameworks that treat regulatory requirements as infrastructure rather than instruction. The full blog post with detailed implementation guidance for classification, DLP, retention, and e-discovery is linked in the description. Compliance that depends on human memory will eventually fail. Compliance that's built into the infrastructure won't.